you've been a regular or even semi-regular participant in what Personalist Manifestos is up to, chances are you've heard the name Brian Brock mentioned by me and or other people that I have conversations with. Because Brian was my PhD supervisor, and an excellent one at that, he's a big influence, just as he is for so many other people I know. But as far as Brian's influence on me goes, he walked with me while I went on the long journey of researching Jacques Ellul and Paul Virilio for my PhD thesis. And not only that, he was there to review and endorse that thesis when it became a monograph. So given his involvement, his ongoing supervision and support, he spent a fair amount of time reading, writing, and talking about Ellul with me. And of course, he's also spent a lot of time reading, writing, and talking about other texts and scholars too. In this conversation, we talk about Brian's soon-to-be released book, Joining Creation's Praise, a Theological Ethic of Creatureliness. As you'll discover, this book has been years in the making, and its publication represents a massive accomplishment as it follows the first few chapters of Genesis in order to discover the things that the sages of Israel took to be crucial for the ethical life of human beings among other creatures in God's world. Having also spent a fair amount of time doing such reflection on the first few chapters of Genesis, I think Ellul would be intrigued by this book if he were alive today. So it only makes sense that I would have Brian join me here for a conversation. So with that, here's my conversation with Brian. And as I mentioned prior to the previous Personalist Manifesto's conversation with Natalie Carnes, make sure to check out the conference description and call for papers for the 2026 International Jacques Ellul Society Conference taking place at Notre Dame. I promise you, it's always a good time hanging out with the Ellul Society folks. I'll put a link in the show notes as usual.
I don't really know. The first question is the hardest one.
Who is Brian Brock?
Yeah.
That's the hardest one? Well,
Yeah.
good. Then let's get the hardest one. We're recording, by the way. We'll
Got
get the
it.
hardest one out of the way, and then it'll be easy from then on out. So tell us a little bit
All right.
about who Brian Brock is.
I'm a kid from the backwoods of Texas, the lowlands, Mosquito Coast in
Hmm.
on the back end of Houston, and grew up in a kind of Bible tradition, relatively fundamentalist, and um, eventually kind of had a Damascus Road experience where I realized that I didn't really understand how it all hang together, even though I knew it quite well. And um, I was told by a couple of senior academics that if I wanted to get behind the problems of modern thought that I was struggling with in ethics, I needed to come to Europe. So I kind of took a quest to find theology behind modernity, and have been over in Europe working for 30 years or so.
Nice. The sages told you to go to Europe.
Yeah. Yeah, that I mean, yeah, in many ways, well, I started out in medical ethics, and medical ethics is a fundamentally modern discipline.
Mhm.
And if you are dissatisfied with the state of discourse in medical ethics, you need resources from behind modernity. And these senior scholars said, you're not going to be taught that if you go to any of the big American institutions.
Right. What drew you to medical ethics? Like, it doesn't strike me as something that most people wake up one day and are like, I want to study medical ethics. Like, so where did that initial interest emerge?
Yeah, well, I thought about medicine when I was in high school, and so had done kind of pre-med stuff,
Mm.
and then I did biology in college and really enjoyed it in its breadth. And the closer I looked at the day-to-day life of either being a kind of medical researcher or a doctor, the less appealing it became to me. So I kind of went and taught school for a year, and I thought, with junior high kids, and I thought, this is absolutely bone crushing work. I need to go dig ditches or do something else. And
Digging ditches is preferable to junior
I,
high.
I wasn't I wasn't geared for 7 hours of keeping junior high kids entertained. And so it sort of seemed to connect to me that what I'd learned and enjoyed in the kind of medical biological domain, I could maybe go further with if I thought about how the church could talk better about all the medical ethical dilemmas that were starting to become pretty public in the 80s. And I looked in my area, and there was a program in Christian ethics, Christian medical ethics, that was in a research hospital. It's called biomedical and clinical ethics, and that seemed really perfect. And I applied and was accepted, and that was the real beginning.
Yeah, that was the beginning. I have to agree with you on the junior high piece. I started teaching grade 4 and 5 Sunday school at my church, and PhDs, people who teach in higher ed, often think that they're the like upper echelons of education, the expert teacher. I'm like, it has nothing. Teaching undergrads and grads has nothing on teaching grade 4 and 5. I've learned so much about being a teacher from working with them because a young adult or an adult, like, at least they'll pretend they're still engaged if they're bored. Whereas grade, they'll just tell you straight out, this is
Yeah,
boring, this is
yeah,
cringe. Like,
exactly.
we talked about that last week. What do you mean? That doesn't make sense. And then there's, kids doing cartwheels and like throwing things. And yeah, I mad respect for primary and middle school teachers. I don't know how they do it.
Agreed.
So I wanted to talk about your soon to be released book, which is this is the first of multiple volumes, Joining Creation's
No,
Praise.
no, it's all in one.
It's all in one?
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's why it's 1,200 pages.
Okay. Right.
Uh,
Because yeah, I mean I have it in two sections, so I assumed that it was going to be like a volume 1 and 2 thing, but no, it's a whole volume.
it'll be in when it first comes out in the hardback. It'll be one doorstop, and but it's too big to be in one volume when it comes out in
Ah,
paperback. So it'll be in. It does have a break in the pagination, so it'll be two paperbacks,
right.
two
Okay.
600-page paperbacks. Yes,
Right. So it's all released at the same time, but if you get it in paperback, it's like a box set album.
basically, yeah. And
Okay.
the issue was that is it would be even bigger if there was a kind of index and bibliography in both volumes. So the first volume will have the sort of detailed table of contents and no index, and the second one will have all the apparatus basically.
Wow. So it's a big project.
It is, yes. I just sent the name index off today, so I'm officially finished with everything that I have to do with it, and I'm glad to be turning into the let's talk about it stage.
Congratulations. That's a
Thank you.
that's a big milestone. I thought that the last time we spoke, there's more of a cloud, but I feel like the cloud is lifted.
Well, I wanted to be done with it at the end of last summer,
Right.
and now it's the end of the whole academic year, and when I've had to work on it. So I'm delighted for it to be done.
So how long have you been working on it? Because, when I was studying Aberdeen, like I remember that it was still in process. So how
Yeah.
long has this project been?
Well, I was glad you asked me because have been my throwaway comment has been a decade or so, but then I
Yeah.
went and and looked, and I realized that I taught it first here in Aberdeen, roughly in the same structure in 2007.
Hmm.
But before that, I had taught volume one of Luther's Ethics with Amy Laura Hall at Duke when I was there on sabbatical. And basically, I discovered Luther's commentary on Genesis, which I thought was really mind blowing when I was doing my postdoctoral work So, I mean, it's probably closer to 20 years I've been working on it.
Wow. So is that when the idea for the book emerged, when you discovered Luther's commentary on Genesis, or was this something that you always had anticipated doing?
No, I, well, I'm kind of working my way through the topics raised in the church dogmatics.
Mm,
So my first book was on Revelation, sort of taking that to how does Revelation work, which is like volume one of the church dogmatics. And I was really impacted in my graduate study by Church Dogmatics 3.4, which is his ethics of creation, Barth's ethics of creation.
mm,
And that is itself, I don't know, 800 pages, and systematically shows how all this whole range of ethical topics are connected to one another. And I found that really very powerful. And also the first volume of his creation, so Church Dogmatics 3.1, is a commentary on the primeval history, the first three chapters of Genesis. So I mean, in a way, I thought it's been 50 years since that volume was published, and nobody's really attempted anything like it. There's been a few texts that creep up on something like that, but I felt like that I'd been so impacted by seeing how a theological logic can tie together different topics in a way that makes it fruitful and creative to do work in different topics. And our Christian ethics tends, or it has in the last 15, 20 years, sort of balkanized into topical treatments. So, specific themes, specific questions, and very little work has been done trying to show how themes fit together. And so that I felt like the doctrine of creation, which has been a kind of contested and important theme in Protestantism, Protestant ethics specifically, is one that was important for us to be articulate about. And showing how it helps to tie topics together is, I think, something that really each generation can use. And so that's the backdrop of why I thought this would be something I should do. It took me longer to finish it than I expected to, and it's certainly bigger, but I'm still happy that I've done it.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's normally how it goes, right? There's the idea of
Yeah.
how long it's going to take, and then there's the reality of how long it actually takes. I mean, that does offer a really helpful backdrop because, I mean, you do talk about the themes of Exodus and liberation versus like the themes of Genesis, and there's more like a settledness and structure, whereas like the Exodus, the motif is deliverance from something to something, right? And how much of ethics takes that position of like, okay, here's the current state of things, right? We're locked up, we're enslaved, and we need to be delivered to something. And of course, that's always a helpful approach. But what does it also look like to say? What does it look like to rest within structures that have been given? Um, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Absolutely.
think the more I dug into, well, the longer I lived with the Genesis account, the more it seemed obvious to me that the best way to talk about what they're doing, the authors of the first 4 or 10 chapters of Genesis, they're trying to direct our attention to things that happen in the God world relation, and so they're tuning our perception. And I thought, that they're telling it as a story of beginnings is an indication that they think something we're supposed to be seeing was always there and is still there, and it's not everything, right? It's different. It's subtly different from what's usually called a natural law theology that says that it draws a parallel between physical laws of nature and the moral universe, to say that in the same way that gravity has always been there and functioned in the same way, there's at creation the moral laws of the universe were set in place. And I think that's neither quite right in relation to the Genesis text, nor and it sort of creates problems in Protestant ethics that need to be sort of handled directly, because if they're not handled directly, then Protestants usually sort of slide back into something like a natural law type position.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think I mean, this is something throughout all of your work, but I uh, see this in this book especially is oftentimes when you're dealing with the Genesis text, right? There's an impulse to describe things as they are and sort of like go and do likewise.
Yeah,
But you're complicating that a little bit to say that maybe things seem to be what they are, but actually maybe there's more going on. Or how do we look at things to see the multiple appearances, and how is God working in and through creation to change the way we think things
yeah,
are, and therefore how we live. Right, which is kind of you're trying to find this sweet spot of like not sort of just natural law determinative or creation's telling us nothing whatsoever, but
yeah,
it's telling us something, but how is creation telling us something?
yeah, exactly. Or how is uh, God's communication with us working within and symbiotically with God's creative acts at the beginning?
Yeah. So how does this book connect to, if not represent, a bit of a culmination of the other books that focus on technology, scripture, ethics, disability, in your commentaries? Like, um, would you say that it represents kind of like a milestone, in that you can sort of read this and then go back and see what you're up to in the other texts?
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. And there'll be kind of outcroppings of bits of argument from the earlier books
Hmm.
in this one. And I've tried to make the connections in footnotes for those who are interested. Not, I'm not trying to sort of create a system, but there are arguments that I make in this book that are more thoroughly developed in previous works. And I think that one way in which it's really drawing together earlier work is that my singing the ethos of God, which, as I sort of indicated, was the doctrine of revelation, ended with treatment of Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm. So the idea that Genesis is the only place the Bible talks about creation is the kind of the low grade point that I'm trying to bring to readers. Actually, lots of biblical genres are wrestling with the question of how to talk about creation. And in fact, one of the places I broach this topic directly is in a debate with David Kelsey, who in his Eccentric Existence says, if we want to talk about creation for the purposes of Christian ethics, we need to talk about the wisdom literature, because the wisdom literature talks about creation in a cyclical. There's time to be born and a time to die, and the seasons go in circles. And he says this is the ethically relevant doctrine of creation for Christian ethics. And so I'm kind of in a debate with different biblical scholars who would say this is the part of the Old Testament that gives us creation. And I think that was prompted by the Psalms, because the Psalms talk about creation as communicative and also as transparently something that can be gloried in. And more to the point, the psalmists are constantly thinking about God as an agent who does things, whose works can be praised. And I think that's the seminal insight that I took to reading Genesis. Is this is a story about God has done, so that we can praise those acts in the in the public assembly, is would be the way the psalmist put it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, this is one theologian talking to another, but one of the impulses, within biblical studies is to uh, create pretty, you know, uh, hard boundaries between, from text to text,
Mhm.
right? So this, like, we're gonna stay here, and we're gonna get everything that we can about this particular book or this particular section in this book, and that's gonna sort of like unlock, meaning. But what you're pushing for is actually how does Genesis coupled with Psalms set us up to hear something that is resonant from Genesis to Revelation.
Mhm.
And I do think the wisdom literature plays a role in that, but not exclusively so, right? I mean, this is what I love about uh, the wisdom text and the way of wisdom reflected in them is it's a particular way of inhabiting and engaging with creation.
Mhm.
So one person looks at um, the ants, or one person looks at the lizards and rock badgers and has a particular way of describing what's happening.
Mhm.
And then you have the authors of Proverbs coming along, and they're seeing something totally different and putting language to that in a different way. And um, so that is one inroad, but
Mhm.
that's not the only one,
Yeah.
right?
So that,
Um,
I mean, in my debate with Kelsey and some other biblical scholars, he's, as like you say, Kelsey is a systematician working with the strong boundaries that he's inherited from biblical studies,
yeah,
and I'm using engagements with biblical studies to break down those boundaries, and I think that's not too difficult to do, because the biblical authors themselves are not thinking, "Oh, now I'm writing wisdom literature, so I can't refer to salvation history, or I can't refer to eschatology."
yeah,
That's just not what's going on there. And so, if you look more closely at it, you can see that there are decline narratives and salvation ascent narratives running in the primeval history of Genesis, but there's also revelatory aspects, quite kind of open revelatory aspects. Wisdom cries in the streets.
hmm
So, like wisdom is an agent in a way that stops our thinking about wisdom collapsing into a sort of a knowledge set that you gather from looking at the world. At the same time, the wisdom authors clearly thought they were clearly drawing on and modifying the wisdom writings of the nations around. So they could grant there's real knowledge of God's creation among
yeah,
people who don't know the Creator, right? So it's not different in kind, and I think this fluidity is that really frees us to take seriously natural knowledge of the created realm, but also to say, if it's not a venue for God's communicative claim, then we're actually not understanding it in the way the Bible presents it to us.
yeah. I mean, it makes me think about Cain and Abel, right? I mean, Abel, the roots in Havel, right? The
Uh,
vanity vapor, right?
yeah, yeah,
And Abel dies, but he never really goes away,
yeah,
right? That and Cain, the murderer, he's the pragmatist, right? He sees things as they are. He goes ahead, right? Builds the city, he's at the origin of all things, technological, political, artistic.
yeah,
But the ground is still the ground is still cursed, and this it's Abel finds his way back in through other generations that are kind of hidden in plain sight, right? And how is that bearing witness all the way through?
yeah,
But it's not totally in your face.
yeah,
It's just there, right?
And the theme is introduced of a silent world without God in Cain for sure,
Hmm.
right? He departed from God. The God Cain discussion is is as the longest dialogue in the whole primeval history, right? So God doesn't just punish him and send him away. God tries to break through to him conversationally, and Cain, as the Jewish sages say, pushes God back up into heaven. So he silences the world by refusing to listen to this communicative God. And I think that's a really nice encapsulation of the binary alternatives for human life, right? Like either God is kind of quite communicative in all kinds of ways through the material world, or we push God away and we go it alone and we try to make our lives come out successfully.
There was one line near the end of the introduction that really jumped out at me that I think sets the scene for the book, but also a lot of what you're doing throughout your work. And I want to read it. It says, I want the sheer oddness and unintelligibility of the common sense of the biblical and theological traditions to be seen more in the round. So you say that this forms a counter common sense to the apparently common sense of our particular moment. Um, so am I right in saying that this doesn't just capture what you're up to in this book, but in a lot of your work?
Absolutely, yeah. The uh, I think the counter common sense offered in Scripture has its own integrity, and if you sort of sit with it, as the psalmist would say, if you meditate on it long enough, you'll you'll see that it can do work. It doesn't need to be boosted by going to some other philosophical position or some other empirical research. Like it actually is generative of insight, and that I've pointed to that by talking about the way that the psalmists are constantly saying, "Show me your works, and I will praise them in the community." Right? That to them is the basic logic of the life of faith, and that's an example of something that's so counterintuitive to most modern Christians who would say Christian ethics is a matter of kind of distilling biblical principles from the Bible and then applying them in your life. And that's just I think that's the collapse of the biblical common sense into modern common sense.
Yeah. Well, I have two questions in response to that. The first one is more about our our current moment where in and beyond theology, a lot of people are looking for things that verify their common sense and and as a way to dismiss or shut down other people's, right? But what you're going for is how does scripture work against the grain of what seems like common sense to everybody?
Yeah,
That's pretty counterintuitive
yeah,
for these times, right?
yeah,
Where right, like I want to go to scripture and find the verification, of my perspective, my position, my practice. I want to extract this principle and say here, like
yeah,
this is how this is how it should be, right? And this
yeah,
is how we should be. But you're actually starting with the premise that uh, if we all come to the scriptures expecting to have our vision, our sort of ethos, our position just affirmed and sort of pat on the head, like great job, you're doing awesome, keep
yeah,
doing what you're doing. We're starting in the completely wrong place. We should come expecting to have some sort of contradiction, or some sort of, at the very least, like you say, oddness, right? If
Yeah.
it doesn't sound a little bit odd or off, then perhaps we're not looking or listening closely enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd put it even stronger, probably, that the distinctive insight we call Protestantism is how powerful the urge is for sinners to come to all religious knowledge and to our scriptures with the agenda of making ourselves in the right, right?
Hmm.
Self-justification, right? So the doctrine of justification, which is arguably where the Reformation began, was a kind of implacable insistence that God has claimed us, and the us that have been claimed are sinful human beings who want to put themselves in the right. And that's always the domain of faith, and also, I would say, of ethics. Like it, so if we're not alerted to our starting point as sinners being, of course, we're going to look at the Bible and justify ourselves, right? That's what religion is. But faith is something different than religion, right? This is just Barton Bonhoeffer's critique of religion.
Hmm.
If we sort of resist that urge, then actually the fertility of this tradition begins to be far more interesting, and its oddity, as you say.
Yeah. Well, that was the second part of the question that I had for you was on the theme of praise and worship. And how do the themes of place and praise work in your book and your work as a whole? Because when you have a book on Genesis and creation, right? It and praise, right? Like it's in the title,
Yeah,
but the creation piece tends to overshadow the praise piece.
yeah,
But you're actually putting those on the same level,
yeah,
right? You're not saying one or the other, but it can be easy for people, because I think in our sort of our materialist societies, like as soon as you talk creation, then people are like wanting to get into creation and how it works and so
yeah,
forth. But
yeah,
that's not where you're going. You're saying first and foremost, the right posture and relation to creation is one of praise of the creator.
yeah,
And so you write, the subversion affected by the biblical creation story begins by unleashing the question of what human beings should understand as their determinative environment. The core task of a Christian ethic of creatureliness is to rediscover the sweeping import of this question. So you would say, if I'm reading you correctly, that our determined environment is creation, but praise of creator within creation. That's the starting point for, right, what it means to be a creature, and therefore what it means to praise and live the life, and therefore what is ethics.
yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's really nicely captured. I mean, I make two comments about the passage you read out. One is that I'm using the language of Christian ethic of creatureliness very intentionally, because
Hmm.
90% of what Protestants will mean when they talk about creation is either the act of God's act of creating something which is not God,
Hmm.
or the thing which God created, right? The outcome of that act. And I'm asking from the point of view of one of the things that God created. We are one of the things that God created in a kind of long follow-on continuation of that initial creation. And so I'm asking, what does it mean to live like we're creatures and not gods, right? So that's taken directly from the story that's being set up in the primeval history. The boundary is, you were not created to want to be like God. You were created to be in a relationship with the material world, caring and tending for it, knowing that it's God saturated and God is present to it at all in all times. So the fallen state is one in which we don't know that anymore, and so the a Christian ethic of creatureliness is just asking, what does it mean to what did the sages of Israel see when they depicted us in our unfallen state? And I'm trying to say it was life in which nature wasn't silent and God wasn't far away. So another way to put that, to get back to the question of the determinative environment, we live in nature. We call what we see the natural world, and God is somehow outside of nature, right? God is not part of creation. That's the creator-creature distinction, but kind of cashed out in a secularized way. So my actual answer, and I'm only opening up in this early formulation, is to say that our determining environment is eschatology and pneumatology, like to be living in the spirit. That's our actual environment. So I'm trying to highlight the Western common sense that is radically anti-pneumatological.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I talk with students about, especially undergrads, is just the relative novelty of the idea of nature, right? Or who gets to decide what nature is or what natural is, right? That's a common thing. It's like it's natural, therefore it's good.
Yeah,
And the host of assumptions that you need to make, conscious or unconscious, to get to that point is quite there's quite a lot there. And but once you start asking questions about where we get those concepts and how we just take certain things for granted, it becomes harder and harder to ascribe any sort of moral status to what uh, appears to be nature and natural. And
yeah,
there, what I think you're getting at is there's the element of a God who is not only responsible for all that is and what it's becoming, but is also still present and doing things. And how do we become awakened to that presence and that action? Uh, in this sense, it makes me think that a lot of what you're trying to do is put people back in their place, right? Like you're not playing, you're not sort of putting yourself in the position of the spirit. Only the spirit can do that. But
yeah,
how can you work with the witness of scripture and the theological tradition to to put us back in our place, right? And I think about the psalmist who is meditating on a God who is like, why do you care about us, God? Right? You made us a little bit higher than the animals, but a little bit lower than the angels, right? Like that to me, I think it's like it's a I always think about it as like the Goldilocks story, not to trivialize the psalm, but it's like it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's just right. Or the bed's not too
yeah,
hard, it's not too soft, it's just right. Like it's finding that right spot in placement so that you are attuned to a God who is present and at work, but maybe working in ways that you couldn't foresee, um, and in odd ways, in unlikely ways, in particular ways. And lo and behold, maybe that God doesn't just say everything you're doing is great, keep doing what you're doing,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So that I basically the very often the chapters will pick up moments in lived existence where people felt confronted and interrupted by someone in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
Balaam's donkey saying, like, I've been good to you all this time, and now you're beating on me. And then God opens Balaam's eyes and sees that there's the angel of death in front of them. Right? That's not standard issue text in Christian ethics or in preaching, as a matter of fact. But
Yeah.
is certainly an example of uh, a creature speaking God's words in, as is the serpent speaking to Eve, speaking Satan's words, right? There's no problem in the biblical text with all kinds of inner creaturely communications actually being from beyond creation, from figures, from agents outside of creation. And it's a good thing to sort of take one step back. Of course, modern science could only arise by taking certain aspects of the Christian worldview, the stability of creation as providentially supported, and highlighting them while also downplaying some traditional Christian views, right? So it was the rise of modern science took the kind of secularization that you've already hinted at. And what I'm trying to do is, without going back to a pre-modern world, saying, yeah, the laws of nature work in the ways that scientists can see, but that doesn't mean, as most atheists, scientific modern atheists would say, that means that there is no God.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is a job for every generation to ask, how does the common sense of our time infect us? And I think one of the ways that infects modern Christians is that they simply have lost touch with the fact that God is a communicative agent.
Yes, and what do we do when we have a moment where creation seems to be communicating something? Like, to go back to the Balaam's donkey instance, right? Like, one response is like to beat up on the creature that's witnessing, right? And I think that's the typical, you know, to quote Calvin, like, the heart is an idol factory, right? Like, don't trust it, right? Like, you're going to turn
Yeah,
it into, like, so don't trust it, or right, or oh, that's you can't trust this, right? I mean,
yeah,
you talk about the serpent, right? It's that's a scheme of the devil, right?
yeah.
And the trick is to sort of jump out of things, and it's like this constant hermeneutic of suspicion and never
Hmm.
trust. But on the other hand, it's like, don't worship the donkey that just spoke prophetically to
Yeah,
you, right? So
yeah. So
that,
that, I
like,
mean,
one is like uh you know um uh like borderline Manichaeism, and the other is like is the risk of idolatry, right? Or like a hard
yeah.
natural law. You don't there's no reference point beyond the creature that's witnessing
Yeah.
to you. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do constantly in the book is keep material creatures transparent to God's claiming us,
Hmm.
without and connected to the forms of intelligence that animate primarily living things, but actually all creatures. So one way to play this out is to say, before the fall, we were made to hear the call for water from plants, right? Like, we were made to water plants, to garden plants, and that's nonverbal communication, right? That was the nexus of our appropriate unfallen work, is hearing what they needed and responding to it. And it's not different in kind, that activity, to responding to the needs of an infant, right? And I think if you're thinking about creation in this more fine-grained way, it becomes very difficult to say whether the cries of a hungry infant is just that of a kind of animal need, or is also some kind of claim being made on you by God, who has ultimately created that child. So the I'm trying to bring the question of revelation and the question of the the distinctive logic of each living being close together, so that we don't dichotomize them in ways that we.
It does to me. This puts you within the line of like Augustine and Luther, but also Kierkegaard. Um, and how he talks about the three spheres of aesthetic, ethical, and religious. And the the aesthetic person is driven by their senses, their preoccupation with what they can see and experience, and their desires. The ethical is like, well, maybe I shouldn't just be driven by that all of the time. Maybe that's there's more, right? And then the religious is like the sort of the final phase of this relationship with God. That, but it's not like you leave behind the ethical and the aesthetic,
Yeah.
right? That the idea is to sort of ascend the ladder and then just like drop the ladder because you've reached this pure sort of angelic state where you're not in tune with, questions around how I should be within the world, or even just like how am I drawn to this and not to that in the world. But those things are all in holistic relationship, but it's governed by a particular relationship, namely a God who is present with us and working with us. Am I reading you right on that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't engage much directly with Kierkegaard, but I definitely talk try to find images of moments when we are in creaturely relations, which there's another layer of what's going on. I sort of use the example of the lecture
Hmm.
intermittently at various places in the book. Like if there, a lecture is a in a university is a it's an event, right? It's not the room that it's in. It's it can change to another room, and a gathering of someone who's assigned to do a lecture and a class cannot actually achieve the level of a lecture. And one of the ways that that can happen is that the lecturer, if you think about what's a bad lecture, somebody is up there basically treating it as a self-aggrandizement exercise, trying to be a comedian and just get the accolades of the students, not really teach anything. Or a student can be just listening to the lecture to try to figure out things about the personal life of the one who's lecturing, right? There are ways to short circuit what the lecture actually is, which is conveying knowledge that is not just here's the words going on, or look at me as a person. It's kind of at a very specific level, and our relation to God as creatures is totally open at a specific level, but we need to attend to that level. And that's, I think, what the creation accounts, the authors of the creation accounts are trying to say. Attend at this level and you'll understand
Yeah.
what God's saying to you.
Yeah. I think that's a really helpful image because it's it's trying to start a dialogue, right? It's not a monologue, right? So listen and take all the notes and make sure you study for the test. But I'm going to give you some information with a view to that inspiring you to a dialogue in a particular moment at a particular time, or for particular moments at particular times.
Yeah.
And I, teaching in a North American context, but having studied in the UK, um, seeing the way the UK model of learning is approached, it's at least in the way that it was done in Aberdeen, is much more dialogical. And the amount that you learn when you approach a lecture as a dialogue, where you don't know where it's actually going to go. You have some, you know, uh, content that you're gonna focus on. You have some form to it, but within that form, there's space given for you to go beyond what you anticipated. And coming back to North America and teaching here, the expectation often is like, all right, Prof's coming in, he's going to do a presentation, he's going to have the PowerPoint, and he's going to give me the information. I'm going to write it down, and then I'm going to be tested on that. And I just don't
Yeah, that's a
want.
product. It's
Yeah,
producing knowledgeable students as an outcome.
yeah,
And I think that, I mean, ironically, that North American pedagogy runs foul of the key ideology of North American kind of liberalism, which is autonomy, right? It's like the learning that's going on there is total heteronomy.
Yeah.
I am the expert. I will tell you what you need to know, and you need to regurgitate that back to me.
Yeah.
And I actually believe in autonomy more at this phase. I think no one responds to God on anyone else's rules. Everyone has to respond to God in themselves. They do that. We do that from what we've learned from others. But the ethicist is not an expert in a knowledge set that people in classrooms are supposed to regurgitate to make the ethicist happy. The ethicist is provoking in each person a heightened awareness of the God to whom they themselves are responsible. At that level, I really am a Kierkegaardian. I mean, I learned a lot from
Yeah.
Kierkegaard's insistence that before God, we're all alone.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's easy to take that as, okay, so you have to be self-sufficient and knowledgeable at all places and all times, but that's not what I think you're saying. That's not what Kierkegaard's saying. And you're totally right. I mean, I've literally got feedback on classes I've taught, and they're anonymous. I don't know who wrote it, but one student literally said, uh, I did not pay to hear other students talk.
I mean, I have some sympathy for that. I've had that sensation as a student. Uh, so, there are risks to all kinds of pedagogical forms. On the other hand, um, uh, how to decompress the tendency of having, there is an authority to being a teacher,
Oh, for
a
sure.
spiritual and actual authority, and how to discharge that in a way that doesn't let the class be taken over by someone who really doesn't have that authority,
Oh,
and
for
yet
sure.
doesn't turn all the class into passive recipients. Where that seems like the outer boundaries that we have to sort of find a way, iteration
Yeah.
by iteration, through.
I mean, we're back at the finding the right place. I mean,
Yeah,
it is, you have to find this sweet spot between treating each person as a subject with a view, with
yeah,
experiences, with a certain degree of expertise, knowledge that can contribute, but there's also a place in which, yeah, if there is a person who's in the position of like leading and translating knowledge and helping rein it in when it gets out of control.
yeah,
And that actually kind of sounds like the life of the church, right? It's not to
yeah,
say that that's like an argument or an apologetic for total hierarchy and authority, but actually we do need some systems, we do need some order, we do need some people to sort of gather people and give some direction and help determine, when we're in the sweet spot and when we're getting out of control, but don't exploit that, right?
yeah.
Right. So we've set the sort of backdrop for this project. Can you talk a little bit about the architecture of it? So, you lay the groundwork like we are here, but then you actually get into specific Genesis text and you relate those to specific topics. So, can you sketch out, like, if someone's opening the book, what they can expect, in broad brushstrokes?
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's five parts, and I've committed myself to the rule of sort of commenting as as each passage sort of the questions that it throws up. So, in many ways, the first section, creation and worship, is the hardest one, but that's because a lot of pretty abstract themes are broached at the beginning. In the beginning being one of the obvious ones.
Right.
So, what is the relationship between God's act God's mode of communication as word, God's creating as word. And there, one of the moves that I set out, which I think is pretty important for the project as a whole and has really caught people's attention, is I use the language of wayfinding. So I'm drawing on some of that wisdom literature imagery to say finding your way as creatures is more like wandering around and sensing what's close to you and seeing which roots work and which roots don't. And Scripture helps you when you inhabit it to do that. And that's different from thinking of Scripture as a map or a rule book. So it's a kind of genre question that I open up. And then the chapter 1 up into the beginning of chapter 2 asks questions about the image of God and the dominion command. And then it ends with Sabbath. So what are we supposed to do with this kind of alternative time called Sabbath, and how does that relate to Christian ethics? So that's part 1. Then part 2 is called Emplacement in Creation. So what is the Genesis story, specifically starting with the beginning of chapter 2, trying to tell us about the place where we live as creatures? What does it mean that we were? I mean, I think it's a striking feature of the Genesis text that we're pictured as being in a garden and we end in a city, right? That's, everyone knows that. But I'd go a little further into asking what sort of things are entailed in the modes of attention that gardeners have to garden well, because I think that's in view especially in chapter 2 of Genesis. So how does worship and work fit together? How do we think about property? Because this is a place where we have responsibility. Property is the way that Western societies are organized to delimit the property that we are responsible for and which nobody else can have. And one of the fun bits of that second part is chapter 11, where I take an odd route into ecological questions by looking at waste, which is not often a topic in Christian ethics. And I use as one of those domains where looking into our garbage and recycling bin, we invites a revelatory verdict on how trashy our lives are. And so that was a fun piece of the project. The third part is called Persons in Creation, and there I look at the episode of Adam's naming the animals, and then the arrival of the man and woman together on the scene, and I use that to ask questions about what it means to recognize other people, because I think Adam does name the animals, but he doesn't name the woman that's brought to him in the first instance. That happens later when he names her Eve, because she was the mother of all that live. And that is also the fact that God brings the woman to the man is quite clearly in the idiom of a betrothal. And so there's also the topic of marriage is introduced there. Part 4 is called Disunion in Creation. So it begins chapter 3. So there I'm asking, like, what is the fall, and how does sin work? And there I pick up 2 themes that the text is opening up for us. One is, what is eating doing, right? Because basically the disobedience is eating, and Eucharist is a type of eating. How do these forms of eating, these different forms of eating, what do they reveal about the ethics of eating? And we can say the same thing about death, right? Like Adam and Eve were mortal before the fall, but then that they will die is also part of the punishment. So I sort of put that as there's 2 kinds of eating and there's 2 kinds of dying, and the text is introducing those two kinds that say something ethically. And then again, there's kind of, in my view, a fun ending to part four, where I do a long chapter on the fact that the first thing that they do after they sin is cover themselves. And the closer you look at that, in a world where we have nude bitches and cosmetic surgery, the more odd our common sense becomes, and also the more odd the biblical common sense becomes. And so I have a chapter on the ethics of dressing. The last part is called Living Together in Fallen Creation. And of course, everything in this last section is after the fall. So starting with Genesis 3:16, Eve says, I've produced a man with the first birth of Cain. And so there's a chapter on kinship and homemaking. And then Cain kills his brother, and gets a mark from God, which is the traditional account of the beginning of government, that God institutes government with that mark by stopping revenge killing. Then Cain's grandson builds a city, and we talk about technology there, and then ends with the question of what is the public, and contrast what's being said about Babel by the story of Pentecost. What do those two cities tell us about what counts as a public, theologically understood?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, there's so many off ramps I want to take now. Um, but let's start with the Babel and Pentecost, because I have been revisiting Pentecost, as it were, and I've been thinking a lot about Peter's sermon, and I think it speaks to some of the decisions you're making in who you're engaging with throughout your book, and who you are not, and why. Um, and so I'm going to link this to Peter's sermon, right? He quotes Joel, and he talks about the visions and dreams that are coming, and he says but it's not coming to the people in power, right? It's coming to your sons and your daughters, so younger people, right? It's coming to older people, and it's coming to the slaves, even slaves. And in that group, like, there's no it's he's no Pharisees, no scribes,
Yeah.
no lawyers, no people, right, in positions of power. And then, of course, the reality of Peter being the one preaching it. I mean, he wasn't the sort of prime material for preachers, right? And how that is a type of witness that is very resonant with the Beatitudes and the features of the text that say the presence of God is with those who are considered not with God, right? And this does fit in, I think, to some of the conversations that you're engaging throughout the book, is that, yes, you are engaging with some of the great theologians within the great tradition, but that's not only who you're engaging with, right? You're also engaging with some of the niches and marginal voices within theology, but you're not taking either wholesale, but you do give place to the unlikely voices, the more radical voices, and so forth. And so, can you talk about that feature of your book? Like, you're grounding all of it within the scriptural text, but how it is that you're reading text, you engage a multiplicity of sources without necessarily taking uh, any of them totally wholesale.
Yeah, as you sort of hinted out, as I hinted out in earlier discussion, I think there's a sort of bad habit in contemporary theology to to um, to say, well, our sort of core text is an ancient doctrine, or an ancient tale full of anachronisms that we can't possibly take serious today, and the tradition is full of espousals of injustices that we're embarrassed of, and so we need to take a move or two out of either scripture or tradition and harness them to something that's interesting in the contemporary academy, philosophy, empirical study of some trend, and that'll make it interesting, and that'll make it Christian theology. And I'm trying to say, if you actually understand something like, for instance, what the writers of Acts are trying to do when they tell the story of Pentecost, which is obviously meant to be an inversion of the Babel story, then you come up with a picture of political life, an alternative between two types of political life that is very fertile for talking about our world. So the Babelites refuse to spread out into all the world, and they draw together, and they have a technology, and they have kind of a unifaceted agreement to make a name for themselves. So they sort of inflame the self-interest. So there's a kind of homogeneous totality in their politics organized around their technology, and it's designed to display their glory and the non-existence of God. And Babel is obviously the opposite of that. It's a politics of striking diversity, and also with a kind of flat hierarchy, but which is animated by God's own making of connections between people who wouldn't normally go together. I think that's a strikingly recurrent set of sensibilities in various places in the New Testament. Most kind of elaborated in 1 Corinthians 12 when Paul is talking about the body of Christ as a sort of circulator of gifts, and where the least honorable are honored, given the greatest honor. So that I present that as two types of politics: the politics that tries to make a name for itself, and I think always falls into a kind of silent, a silent cosmos in which authoritarian politics almost inevitably becomes the best way to get things done. And this interpersonal communion that's created by a living spirit of the Trinitarian God that opens people's eyes to, oh, wait a second, we don't have to be against one another. I find that vision really quite engaging. So I'm just trying to over and over repeat what's engaging about it in different contexts, and show us how, if you're using your dressing to try to capture other people's attention and control that attention and mold it for your own purposes, that's going to look different than dressing, which is trying to invite communion across difference. And the reason dressing, among many other examples, is such a useful domain to talk about, to show these different grammars, is that dressing never stands still, right? Like what the outsiders and rebels are wearing in year X is 3 years later what the masses are wearing, and which you have to wear to fit in. And so the temporality of creaturely life as a dialogue amongst living persons who will either try to control one another or try to welcome and entrust is that I just find that a fascinating, constantly fascinating and ramifying difference in logic.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah, I mean, there's, again, it's like, how do we hear the letter writers of the New Testament when they're talking about such things as like clothing and hair, right? Is it just a bunch of controlling patriarchs who want to control everybody, or is there more going on there, right? In the way that you're talking about, and how there's a certain way of um, living one's life with God. There's a certain way of being a disciple. There's a certain way of being the church in which nothing is outside of our consideration as a location for God to speak.
Mhm.
And what does it look like to be attentive to that, from everything as big as, the 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 ceremonies and the iconography of the politicians, but also right down to whether or not, um, you wear this or that, or whether you put this on your head or you don't, or whether your hair is
Yeah.
this length or not, or whether you wear jewelry or you don't. That
Yeah.
um, the macro is in the micro, and the micro is
Yeah.
in the macro.
I mean,
And
another way to put the basic insight that I'm working out is one that I got from Johann Hamann in his debate with Kant, who was his friend. He's not well known, but he says the difference between him and Kant is can be illustrated by thinking about how coins work. Kant thinks if you extract the transcendental from what's going on, you know it truly, and Haman's retort is that's like saying you'll get more worth out of a coin by sanding off the images on the surface to just get a smooth disc of metal. Haman says the communication that is money is all about the surface details. That's how communication works. It's not about getting the eternal truth. And that's why again, this is just another iteration of saying modern Protestants very often treat the Bible as a sort of repository of eternal truths, not and the texture of the stories gets passed over without even being registered. So they've turned the Bible into kind of sanded coins, and they don't realize that ultimately sanded coins are not coins at all. They're not tender because they don't create the communicative act, which is the transfer of wealth.
yeah, I mean, and that's, to me, sounds a lot like what's going on when Jesus is being asked, should we pay our taxes? And Jesus is like, can you give me one of the coins, right? Well, whose likeness is on it?
Yeah,
Caesar's, right? It matters that Caesar's image is on that coin. It's an inroad to a whole heap of realities that they're dealing with at the time, and the fact that they have those coins actually show their complicity within that system, right?
yeah,
Shows the type of politics that the people who are asking that question are a part of.
yeah,
And then from there, of course, Jesus relativizes it.
yeah,
Well, just give him back what's his,
yeah.
right?
I mean, that's a really nice connection because we're all Christians are carrying around in their pockets and in their clothes and in their fillings and other medical insertions. We carry our world and its forces as intimately as all of those objects. And I think living as a creature should open us to those kind of reflective moments where we say, "Oh yeah, well, it is the government's image on this coin. What's implied in carrying that image with me, like a talisman, like an icon?" And I think that opens up both the complexity of ethical decision making and also the suppleness of theological hermeneutics. And I mean, ultimately, I'm in a long rebellion against the reduction of ethics to very simple maxims, right? Like in my world, I grew up with that you don't drink or smoke or go with girls that do, right? And I mean, there was a little more to it than that, but not too much, right? There's a vast reign of do what you will, the adiaphora, it's up to you, but don't do a short list of things that it might be difficult. But and so in a way, that's why I went into medical ethics, is I'm like, well, that kind of morality just can't touch everything that our society is genuinely thinking about. And surely, if Christians can't touch the ethical questions of secular humanity that arise from their trying to keep themselves alive and healthy, we don't know what we're talking about.
Well, I just have two more questions as we wind down here, and they're related. Is the what was the hardest part of the book to write, and what was the most fun for you? Maybe those two are related if you're the type of person who gets enjoyment from the challenge. But
Yeah,
I'd like to hear you speak to what was the hardest to write and what was the most
yeah.
fun.
Well, I've pointed to some of the fun topics: garbage, ethics of clothing, architecture, naming. I I'm really pretty pleased that at the heart of the book, I talk about I sort of unfold an old trope about marriage as a microcosm of problems of human relation by developing the idea of counter hearers. So I'm basically meditating more on the textual detail that I don't think I'd ever really taken very seriously. That the serpent addresses Eve in the plural, which suggests that Adam was there. So there's of course all kinds of debates about what happened in that interchange between Eve and the serpent. But the place that I go is to say the man, that was the last stop for the man to speak up and say, did God really say that? And I think that by putting that moment in the very fall narrative, it opens up the thought that people who are different from us, we need to hear what they have to say, and the way for us to engage one another as Christians is to ask, did God really say? Right. So there's a kind of there's an inner point of orientation for our talking about ethical issues that we dispute about, and there's also a larger frame about the necessity of that confrontation. This goes back to the earlier point that we were talking about how do you not just turn Christianity into self-justification. Well, you need to have a worked out account of how to expect God to interrupt you. And I've found the discussion of this idea of counter hearers as really quite fertile, and then elaborate that by talking about how it might work in other contexts. Probably the most challenging part associated with this Adam and Eve is that the text basically forces you to deal with sexuality issues, which are obviously contested, and I know you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. So yeah, that felt quite ticklish, and to my surprise, my Phil Ziegler's basically my next door office mate, and he's written a book on sin, and I found writing the stuff about sin, I had to push myself to do it in a way that I hadn't expected to. I just didn't find it energizing, and that was a bit of self-knowledge.
Yeah. Well, I do appreciate though the way that you do approach the thorny topic of sin, right? I mean, maybe that is a bit of the background, your background of growing up in a more fundamentalist, don't do this, don't do that. Like if you
Yeah,
grow up in that sort of sort of world, right? Like when you talk about sin, like it's instant trigger, right?
yeah,
So you're
yeah,
like, oh gosh, I guess I got to talk about it, but I don't want to do, yeah. But the way that you frame it as anti-doxology, I think is very helpful, right? That if, going back to some of the earlier parts of our conversation here, is like if our correct place as creatures is within creation, attentive to how our Creator is at work within it and in grateful response to that work, then sin is a disconnection from any one of those reference points, creation or creator, or both, and therefore a, turn inward, right? Like
Yeah.
the sicut deus, or homo incurvatus, right? This idea,
Yeah.
right? So that's when things go wrong, is when we turn away from attentiveness to our creator and grateful response to him. But I can imagine that also being difficult to lay out, just the way in which it's been used.
I mean, I think that's a really perceptive sort of description of why it was a problem for me. And I wouldn't have seen it as clearly as you just put it, but I do think both the sin and the sexuality topic are ones that, I mean, they're totally on the surface of the text. So you cannot get away from them. And they're so contentious and, more to the point, have been harnessed by Christians so so destructively against people, that I kind of had to push through some inner resistance to taking a position. And I think that's part of the discipline of being a theologian, is that the text is demanding that
Mhm.
we handle these issues, and that's part of the kind of discipline of letting Scripture force us out of our own ruts. And I do think on both topics, I feel like I was driven into new territory. But just that it's a diagnostic thing to realize, oh, wait a second, I have some resistance to working on this topic.
Sure. Well, and I also think this goes to the second part of my thoughts on what you're saying here is how do we how do we this idea of counter hearing, how do we hear others, um and in those moments of conflict, or confrontation, disruption, how do we find a way to speak? And if our response is to say nothing, that's not that's going to have problems. But also there's the authoritarian impulse to just shut it down, right?
Mm.
And what you're pushing for is neither. Is what does it mean to create space for meaningful dialogue, so that if the question, did God really say, comes up, that it's a quiet but firm and engaged, no, he didn't.
Yeah. I mean,
Or yes,
I
he
found
did,
I,
right? Like, because
yeah,
once you start getting into a certain, like, uh not saying anything too aggressive, or getting into procedural, well, too much of this, too much of that, it's
yeah,
like, what is the attentive, quiet, engaged response?
yeah,
Like, that's the way forward. And if we
yeah,
don't have the possibility of that type of dialogue, we're in trouble. And I think that
yeah,
explains a lot of why we are where we are today,
yeah.
right? As
I
Ellul
totally
says,
agree. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that
And I think
if
we are. I think we are in trouble, and that means that uh, the kind of the sin that besets us is in the domain of rhetoric and conversion. So this counter hearer theme really is right at the kind of hinge of the whole treatment. And what I found, the kind of trigger to take this discussion to another level, came from a book by Catherine von Kellenbach, who looks at it's a kind of historical study of the convicted SS guards in concentration camps, all of whom were one way or the other Christian, many of whom were married, and all of whom had sort of chaplains around, pastors around. So she's tracing in a quite fine-grained way how those interactions were running, and she points out, actually, of like 25 of those men, one of them repented, and she traces the story of the role played by his pastor and his wife, and basically the wife said, once he's done his time, if he gets out, I'm not going to stay married to him. We're going to get a divorce. And so her pastor was saying, you can't do that because Christians don't get a divorce. And she was really pressing into, if he won't repent of what he did, putting human beings in the oven, I cannot live with him, and I'm not going to back down on that. And eventually she sort of pushed back against the pastors counseling her to stop talking like that. And her husband finally, in fact, did. He was the only one who did anything like a gesture of open remorse for having done such a horrible thing, which is, of course, psychologically devastating. But I think it's a very nice worked case about how sinners see good difference as threatening difference, and they shut down good difference in a range of ways. And most of the wives basically sided with their husbands. They were doing the work of the Fuhrer, or they were doing something for the good of the nation. And so they didn't confront them. They joined in the evil of their husbands. And so the promise of redemption came through this wife saying, I'm not going to sweep this under the rug. And once you see how that dynamic could work, then all of a sudden you realize how timid Christians are today in facing up to difference in a committed and supple way, and how much they would prefer to just tribally split and remain happily protected by their never running into people who have different opinions. And that, I don't think, that's where the Pentecost politics is essentially being repudiated for something much closer to a Babel politics.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, I think one of the things that I use the universal we, especially in North America, especially within the North American Christianity, and it works its way out in a number of ways, whether it's, the more conservative or more progressive, but if there's this feeling that any sense of discomfort is inherently wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm feeling like I'm being pushed out of my comfort zone, then I need to resist that or get away or avoid. And of course, it's like some discomfort is wrong. It's your body and your brain telling you that, yeah, that there's a disturbance in the force, as it were, to quote Star Wars. But there's also a type of discomfort that puts you right at the edge of possibility of change or conversion, right? I've been thinking about this idea of conversion. Like, we tend to limit conversion to like a one moment and like a one and done thing. But I actually think that conversion is kind of like sanctification, and there's multiple conversions over time, right? So, yes, Paul had his road to Damascus experience, where there was a pretty significant change or conversion, where he went from killing Christians to becoming one. But then there were years of reflection on what that moment meant, and tent making and reworking theology before he goes back and starts preaching, right? Like there's conversions, and then there's moments along the way where he runs into an obstacle, and then he has to rethink this and he has to do that, and we think we're going here, we're going there. And you can't be converted if you're comfortable all the time.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah. Well, that's chapter 2, creating and converting is the topic. I totally agree with you. And I actually use the example of, contentiously of coming out, or of trying to supersede a inferiority complex, right? Like you can say, you can come out, or you can say, I don't want to be shy anymore. And I'm saying conversion to Christ is kind of like those things, right? Like you might say, yeah, I believe. But what that means is as complicated as everything that follows from trying to inhabit your body as not a shy person. It's not going to be done at once. And I think we have been sort of hamstrung in recognizing that work by assuming once saved, always saved, which is, of course, is true in a justification sense, but not in a sanctification sense.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful place to end. Is conversion is the beginning. It's not the end, right? So, uh, thank you for your time, Brian. Thank you for your work. And when can we expect the book to come out so people can order a copy?
End of the summer, September
Okay.
2025.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where can people follow you? Where can people hear about the latest going on with Brian? You
I
have a
think the best
TikTok?
place is just the University of Aberdeen Blue Sky feed.
Okay.
I don't have a social media presence.
Okay. Well, would you ever start a TikTok one day?
You'll have to talk me into it,
Okay.
but I'll
I
listen to you because you know what you're talking about.
I just it's all a performance. It's just a masquerade. It's not actually true, but maybe some of us will start a petition to get you to start a TikTok.
If you, I mean, you're the tech savvy guy, so I'm sure you can mash up what we've said,
Yeah.
clip out little lines, and come up with a
I can
TikTok.
get at least a year out of this. At least a year of TikTok. All right. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.